In the opening months of the Pacific War, American pilots discovered a hard truth in the air. They were not fighting on equal terms. Against them flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter that seemed to defy everything U.S. Naval and Army air doctrine believed about aerial combat. It was light, extraordinarily agile, and flown by highly trained pilots who had already gained real combat experience in China before the war even began. When American P-38 Lightning pilots first met the Zero in combat, the encounter was sobering and often terrifying. The problem was not courage or skill. It was that the Zero held the advantage in the kind of fight American pilots instinctively tried to fight. The Zero was designed with a single obsession, maneuverability. Japanese engineers made deliberate trade-offs that shocked Western designers. Armor plating was minimal. Self-sealing fuel tanks were practically non-existent. The structure was light to the point of fragility. But what the aircraft gained in return was phenomenal turning ability and climb rate. At low and medium speeds, the Zero could pivot through the sky with uncanny grace, pulling into tight horizontal turns that left heavier Allied fighters straining, sliding wide, or stalling out entirely. In a classic dogfight, the swirling, turning engagement pilots had been trained to seek. The Zero was king. American pilots entered the war with training built on pre-war assumptions. U.S. doctrine emphasized individual dogfighting skill, tight turns, and close-range engagements. Pilots were taught that maneuverability meant survival. On paper, the P-38 Lightning seemed like a match for anything Japan could field. It was fast, heavily armed, and technologically advanced, with twin engines, a centralized nose cannon, and long range. But performance charts and combat reality often clash. In the humid skies over the Pacific, theoretical advantages evaporated quickly when pilots tried to turn with a Zero. The P-38 size alone worked against it in these early encounters. Compared to the Zero, the Lightning was larger, heavier, and more complex. Its twin engines generated enormous power, but they also created torque and airflow challenges that became severe during sharp maneuvers. When pilots pulled hard on the controls in a turning fight, especially at certain speeds and altitudes, the aircraft could behave unpredictably. Control forces increased. Response lag appeared. In some cases, pilots were left fighting the plane as much as the enemy. Speed, paradoxically, became both an advantage and a curse. The P-38 was significantly faster than the Zero in level flight and dives, but faster aircraft gain momentum that resists tight turns. When a P-38 tried to match the Zero's turning radius, it bled energy rapidly. A pilot intent on staying nose-to nose with a Japanese fighter might find himself slower, lower, and suddenly defenseless. The Zero, by contrast, thrived at low speeds. Its design allowed it to maintain lift long after Allied planes would begin to stall. In close combat, the Zero could hang in the air in ways that felt almost unnatural to American pilots encountering it for the first time. Even worse, many early engagements played directly into the Zero's strengths. American pilots, eager to engage and protect bombers or ships, often slowed down to stay with the enemy. This was exactly what the Zero wanted. Once a turning fight began, the outcome was painfully predictable. Japanese pilots could slip inside the P-38's turn, line up a shot, and fire with deadly precision. Casualties mounted, and morale suffered as pilots realized that courage alone could not overcome physics and design. Beyond raw aircraft performance, the Zero's early advantage was magnified by experience. Japanese naval aviators were among the best trained pilots in the world at the outbreak of war. Their training regimen was brutal and selective, producing fewer pilots, but ones with exceptional flying skill and discipline. Many had hundreds of flight hours and real combat experience. American pilots, by contrast, were often rushed through expanded training programs to meet wartime demand. They were competent and brave, but they were learning under fire. The psychological effect of this imbalance was profound. American pilots quickly developed a reputation for the Zero as an unbeatable opponent. Stories circulated of Japanese fighters that could turn anything, climb forever, and appear where least expected. Some pilots began to feel that if they were ever drawn into a turning fight, survival depended more on luck than skill. Confidence, so crucial in air combat, took a hit. There were also structural and mechanical limitations that compounded the problem. The P-38's controls at high speed could become heavy and unresponsive, a phenomenon that pilots did not fully understand in the early months of the war. During dives, airflow changes could lock up control surfaces, making it difficult to pull out or adjust aim. While this issue affected many aircraft of the era, it was particularly noticeable in the Lightning because of how pilots tried to use it against the Zero. Instead of exploiting speed and altitude, they often maneuvered aggressively at the edge of the aircraft's control envelope. Communication gaps worsened the situation. Tactical lessons learned by experienced pilots were slow to spread. Official manuals lagged behind reality, and many squadrons operated with incomplete or outdated guidance. Pilots often learned what not to do only after seeing a wingman shot down. The Zero's early successes were not just the result of better aircraft design, but also of an enemy who understood his strengths and exploited Allied uncertainty. The terrain and environment of the Pacific War further tilted the balance. Combat frequently occurred over vast stretches of ocean, dense jungle, or scattered islands. There was little room for error. A mistake in positioning or energy management could send a pilot into the sea with no hope of rescue. In such conditions, the Zero's agility was even more dangerous, allowing Japanese pilots to press attacks aggressively without sacrificing control. American air commanders began to realize that the issue was not that the P-38 was a bad aircraft. It was that it was being used incorrectly. But understanding that fact and turning it into practical, reliable tactics took time. Meanwhile, pilots were still flying daily missions against an enemy that could seemingly climb, and outthink them. This gap between design, intent, and combat use lay at the heart of the problem. The P-38 was never meant to be a classic dogfighter. It was built for speed, firepower, and altitude. Yet pilots, trained in pre-war tactics, instinctively fought it like a smaller, lighter fighter. Against most opponents, this might have been adequate. Against the Zero, it was disastrous. By late 1942, the pattern was unmistakable. Whenever American pilots tried to mix it up with Zeros, losses were high. Whenever they managed to keep their speed, fight vertically, and disengage when needed, survival improved. But these lessons were still inconsistent, unevenly applied, and not yet reinforced by hardware changes or simple mechanical solutions that could help pilots control the aircraft more effectively under combat stress. So the problem was not one single flaw. It was a convergence of factors: an enemy aircraft optimized for turning combat, pilots trained for the wrong kind of fight, mechanical limits misunderstood or underestimated, and a battlefield that punished hesitation and error. The Zero had the advantage not because it was invincible, but because it dictated the terms of the fight, and early on, the P-38 was forced to play by those terms. This is what made the situation so dangerous, and why any solution, no matter how unconventional, was so valuable. Before tactics could evolve, and before official engineering fixes could arrive, Pilots and ground crews needed ways to survive the next mission. The margin between defeat and adaptation was thin, and in that narrow space, even a small improvised change could mean the difference between being maneuvered and turning the tables. On the ground, far from the drama of aerial combat and victory reports, mechanics spent long hours doing work that rarely earned recognition. They were not celebrated aces or strategists. They worked with oil-stained hands, limited tools, and damaged aircraft that had to be ready again by morning. It was in this world, practical, impatient, and focused on survival rather than theory, that the so-called stupid wire trick was born. By the time the problem with the zero became undeniable, frustration among ground crews and pilots had reached a boiling point. Mechanics listened daily to pilots' complaints. Controls felt heavy, the aircraft responded too slowly in sharp maneuvers, and recovery from dives was unpredictable. Official channels offered little immediate help. Engineering updates from manufacturers took months, sometimes years. New manuals lagged behind combat reality. Meanwhile, missions went on and losses continued. Waiting for a perfect solution was not an option. Aircraft mechanics were problem solvers by nature. They understood their machines intimately, not from blueprints or simulations, but from touch, sound, and repeated trial under stress. They knew how control cables moved, how tension translated into surface deflection, and how even tiny mechanical changes could alter how a plane felt in the air. Unlike engineers back home, they were free, sometimes forced, to improvise. In this environment, one mechanic noticed something subtle but crucial. The limitation pilots complained about was not always structural or aerodynamic in origin. In many cases, it was about how quickly and effectively control input translated into aircraft response. The P-38's control system, while robust and reliable, had been designed conservatively. Redundancy, safety margins, and standardized calibration ensured predictable performance, but not necessarily optimal combat responsiveness at the edge of the flight envelope. The mechanic's idea was brutally simple. By adding or rerouting a piece of wire, essentially altering the mechanical linkage or tension in part of the control system, he could slightly change how control forces were transmitted. The modification was small, crude by engineering standards, and entirely unofficial. It did not involve new materials, new parts, or advanced theory. It involved understanding leverage, tension, and mechanical feel. To an engineer trained in peacetime protocols, the idea was reckless. Aircraft control systems were sacred. Any modification risked asymmetry, failure, or unpredictable behavior. There were reasons. Such changes were forbidden without testing and certification. But war has a way of stripping problems down to essentials. Pilots needed better control now, not months from now. The initial reaction to the idea was dismissive. Fellow mechanics joked about it. Officers were skeptical. The phrase "stupid wire trick" captured the prevailing attitude perfectly. It sounded like superstition, like a hangar myth waiting to get someone killed. No official documentation supported it. No flight test program approved it. It violated the culture of orderly engineering, but mechanics had one advantage: they could test quietly. The modification was subtle enough that it did not immediately attract attention. It did not radically alter the aircraft's appearance. It did not require structural changes. It could be installed and removed quickly. When the first pilot took off with the modified aircraft, expectations were low. No one expected a miracle. What came back was not a miracle, but something more valuable, a difference. The pilot reported that the aircraft felt more responsive in certain maneuvers. control input during dives felt smoother. Recovery seemed more predictable. The Lightning still could not turn a zero in a flat dogfight, but it no longer felt like it was fighting its own controls at high speed. The plane seemed to flow better through motion, responding with slightly less lag between pilot intent and aircraft reaction. Encouraged, other pilots volunteered to try. The modification spread quietly, one aircraft at a time. Each mechanic adjusted it with small variations, learning by feel and pilot feedback rather than calculation. This was engineering by iteration, not by theory. If a pilot said the controls felt too sensitive, the wire tension was adjusted. If response still felt sluggish, it was tweaked again. What mattered was not the elegance of the solution, but its effect on pilot confidence. Confidence is an intangible force multiplier in air combat. A pilot who trusts his aircraft is more willing to exploit its strengths. With the wire modification, pilots began to feel they could push the P-38 harder without losing control. They could commit to vertical maneuvers, dives, and high-speed passes, knowing the aircraft would respond when asked. That trust changed behavior in the cockpit. The modification did not magically transform the P-38 into a zero. It did something far more important. It helped pilots stop trying to fly it like one. With better control feedback, pilots began to emphasize speed and altitude. They executed boom and zoom attacks with more precision. They disengaged more confidently, knowing they could recover from dives cleanly. The wire trick did not rewrite aerodynamics. It enabled tactics that aligned with the aircraft's true strengths. What made the idea controversial was not just its informality, but what it represented. It challenged the top-down model of military innovation. Instead of doctrine guiding practice, practice was reshaping doctrine from the bottom up. The mechanic did not wait for permission because permission would come too late. He did not try to solve every problem, only the one directly in front of him. As word spread, variations of the modification appeared at different airfields. Some mechanics refined it. Others abandoned it after mixed results. There was no single canonical version. This inconsistency alarmed some officers, who worried about uncontrolled modifications across the fleet. But by the time questions were asked, the idea was already out in the world, carried by pilot testimony rather than paperwork. The unofficial nature of the fix also meant it evolved quickly. Unlike factory changes frozen in design documents, this solution adapted almost daily. Combat feedback drove improvement. When pilots flew missions and returned with new insights, changes were applied the same night. This speed of iteration was impossible in traditional engineering pipelines. Critically, the modification did not exist in isolation. It worked in tandem with evolving tactics and growing pilot experience. As American pilots learned to avoid turning fights with zeros and emphasize vertical engagement, the improved control response reinforced those lessons. Each successful mission reinforced confidence, which in turn reinforced discipline and tactical restraint. The phrase "stupid wire trick" gradually lost its sting. What had sounded laughable began to sound ingenious. The simplicity of the solution became its strength. It embodied a kind of practical intelligence often overlooked in histories focused on famous engineers and grand designs. This was innovation born of necessity, forged under pressure, and validated by results. It is important to understand that no one involved believed the wire trick was the final answer. It was a stopgap, a bridge between initial vulnerability and later, more formal improvements. Eventually, official engineering changes, better training, and refined tactics reduced the P-38's early disadvantages. But without this kind of informal adaptation, Many pilots might never have survived long enough to benefit from those improvements. The deeper significance of the wire trick lies in what it reveals about how real progress happens in extreme conditions. War compresses timelines and strips away luxury. There is no time for perfect solutions. There is only time for solutions that work enough. The mechanic did not try to fix everything about the P-38. He fixed one small thing that made a meaningful difference. This episode also highlights the intelligence embedded in skilled labor. Mechanics were not merely following orders or turning wrenches. They were analysts, experimenters, and innovators. Their understanding of machines was intimate and embodied. They could sense problems that charts and reports missed. The wire trick was not an act of luck. It was the result of attention, experience, and willingness to act. In hindsight, it is tempting to romanticize the story, to imagine a lone genius defying authority. The reality was less dramatic but more instructive. This was collective problem solving under pressure, enabled by trust between pilots and ground crews. Pilots trusted mechanics enough to fly modified aircraft. Mechanics trusted pilots enough to listen and adapt. That relationship mattered as much as the wire itself. Ultimately, the stupid wire trick worked not because it was clever, but because it was timely. It arrived in the narrow window when the P-38 was good enough to survive, but not yet optimized to thrive. It helped pilots cross that gap. It bought time, and in war, time is often the most precious resource of all. This small, unofficial fix stands as a reminder that innovation does not always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it looks like a piece of wire, installed quietly in a hangar, laughed at by some, trusted by a few, and proven only when someone takes it into the sky and comes back alive. The real turning point did not arrive with a new aircraft, a revolutionary weapon, or some dramatic technological leap. It arrived more quietly through a shift in thinking. As pilots gained experience, as unofficial fixes improved control confidence, and as hard lessons from losses finally sank in, a truth became impossible to ignore. Victory would not come from trying to outbuild or outturn the enemy, but from learning to fight smarter. In the skies over the Pacific, tactics, disciplined, deliberate tactics, began to prove stronger than raw technological comparisons. At first, this realization was deeply uncomfortable. Many pilots entered combat believing that the better airplane should win. When they lost to the Zero, the natural conclusion was that American aircraft were inferior. But this view overlooked a critical fact: no aircraft was universally superior. Every design represented a set of trade-offs. The mistake lay not in the machine alone, but in how it was being used. Once pilots stopped asking how to make the P-38 fight like a Zero, and instead asked how to make it fight like a P-38, the balance began to shift. The most important change was conceptual. Pilots began to think less in terms of individual dogfights and more in terms of energy management. Speed and altitude became currencies to be conserved, spent, and regained. The P-38 excelled in this domain. Its twin engines gave it tremendous power in straight line flight and dives. Its structural strength allowed it to plunge from altitude at speeds the Zero could not safely follow. Once pilots internalized this, engagements transformed from chaotic turning battles into controlled strikes. American pilots learned to enter combat with purpose rather than reflex. Instead of mixing with enemy fighters at the same altitude, they attacked from above. Diving passes replaced turning circles. Fire was delivered in short, concentrated bursts, followed by immediate disengagement back into altitude. This boom and zoom style was not glamorous, but it worked. The Zero, optimized for sustained maneuvering, struggled to respond to an enemy that refused to stay and fight on its terms. Equally important was the willingness to disengage. Early in the war, pilots felt pressure to press every engagement, to prove courage by staying in the fight. As tactics matured, discipline replaced bravado. Pilots learned that survival mattered more than kills, and that breaking contact was not cowardice, it was strategy. The P-38 speed allowed it to leave when conditions became unfavorable. The Zero, once so dominant in turning combat, could do little against an opponent that chose when to fight and when to depart. Teamwork also evolved. Lone wolf heroics gave way to coordinated formations and mutual support. Pairs of aircraft watched each other's backs, covering blind spots and discouraging enemy pursuit. If one pilot made an attack, another stood ready to protect him during his climb back to altitude. This mutual dependency reduced vulnerability and amplified effectiveness. The Zero's early successes had often relied on isolating individual Allied pilots. Tight coordination denied it that opportunity. Experience bred calm. As pilots flew more missions, fear gave way to familiarity. They learned to recognize the Zero's strengths and weaknesses not as abstract concepts, but as predictable behaviors. They knew when a Zero would turn, when it would climb, and when it would hesitate. This predictability became exploitable. Anticipation replaced reaction. Instead of being surprised by the enemy's maneuvers, pilots began to shape encounters in advance. This psychological shift was just as important as the tactical one. Once pilots no longer viewed the Zero as unbeatable, its mystique faded. Confidence returned, not reckless confidence, but grounded confidence rooted in knowledge and repetition. Crews trusted their aircraft, trusted their training, and trusted each other. This trust allowed them to execute tactics consistently under pressure, which is the true test of any military doctrine. Importantly, these tactical improvements did not require superior technology. The Zero remained agile. It remained deadly in close combat. The P-38's fundamental characteristics did not change overnight. What changed was the decision-making in the cockpit. Technology provided capability, but tactics determined how that capability was applied. The same airplane that struggled early in the war became a formidable opponent once pilots understood how to use it correctly. This lesson extended beyond individual engagements. Mission planning began to reflect tactical maturity. Flights were routed to maximize altitude advantage. Escorts were structured to maintain energy rather than cling tightly to bombers at low speed. Engagements were chosen carefully, not impulsively. The emphasis shifted from reacting to enemy actions to imposing conditions the enemy could not exploit. The Zero, designed around a specific vision of air combat, began to suffer as that vision was denied. Its light construction, once an asset, became a liability under sustained pressure. When struck by high-speed passes, it was vulnerable. When forced to chase faster aircraft, it bled what little energy it had. When its pilots tried to push beyond safe limits, mechanical fragility revealed itself. None of these weaknesses were new, but they only mattered once tactics exposed them. Another critical factor was attrition of experience. Early in the war, Japanese pilot quality was exceptional. As losses mounted, that edge diminished. Training programs struggled to replace veterans at the same level of proficiency. American pilots, by contrast, improved steadily. Their training pipelines expanded and adapted. Tactical lessons were institutionalized rather than remaining localized. Over time, the balance of skill shifted, amplifying the impact of smarter tactics. Yet it would be a mistake to reduce this change to numbers or production capacity alone. The heart of the transformation lay in mindset. Pilots learned restraint. They learned patience. They learned that the goal was not to win every maneuver, but to survive the mission and complete objectives. This maturity turned technology into an advantage rather than a burden. The P-38's range, once underappreciated, became strategically vital. It allowed pilots to strike deep escort bombers and choose engagements with foresight. Tactics expanded beyond the immediate dogfight to include positioning hours before contact. Air combat stopped being a test of reflexes alone and became a contest of planning and discipline. What makes this episode enduring is its broader lesson. History often focuses on technological races who had the faster jet, the better radar, the more advanced weapon. But again and again, outcomes hinge on how tools are used, not just what tools exist. The P-38 did not defeat the Zero because it was objectively superior in all respects. It succeeded because pilots learned how to make the enemy fight a losing battle. Tactics beat technology because tactics are adaptable. Technology is fixed once built, but tactics evolve with experience. A doctrine that works today can be refined tomorrow. A mistake can be corrected in the next mission. This flexibility allowed American air power to respond faster than formal engineering changes could ever achieve. The victory was not absolute or immediate. Losses continued. Mistakes were still made, but the trend was unmistakable. As tactics solidified, control of the skies shifted. The Zero no longer dictated engagements. It reacted. And in war, reaction is usually defeat in slow motion. In the end, the story of how the P-38 overcame the Zero is not a story about machines competing in isolation. It is a story about humans learning, adapting, and imposing order on chaos. The aircraft did not suddenly become better. The pilots did. They learned that technology is a tool, not a solution, and that understanding the fight matters more than winning any single fight. This realization echoes far beyond the Pacific War. It is a timeless lesson. Advantages lie not just in what you have, but in how you think. And when thinking changes, outcomes follow.